What if the oldest story we've ever told wasn't the beginning at all? What if it was only the last echo of something far older? Beneath the deserts of southern Iraq, where the air hums softly with heat, and the sand hides the color of time, fragments of clay still whisper in forgotten tongues. Each mark pressed into the wet earth 5,000 years ago was meant to preserve a truth. Yet now, the truth sleeps beneath layers of ruin and silence, waiting for someone willing to listen. So, before you feel too comfortable, take a moment to like this video and subscribe. Only if you truly enjoy the kind of stories that drift between dream and history. And if you're still awake, tell me in the comments where you're listening from, and what time it is there. I'd like to imagine this silence stretching across the world. The story begins not with discovery, but with dust. In the late 19th century, British and French archaeologists dug into the plains near modern-day Uruk. Their spades struck clay that had been hardened by centuries of neglect. Tablets upon tablets stacked like the fossilized memory of an entire people. They were called the Sumerians, and from the moment their name was spoken aloud again, something unsettling began to stir in our timeline. Because what they left behind wasn't the hesitant scroll of a newborn civilization. It was already complex, measured, and deeply aware of the cosmos. The earliest Sumerian records appear as if from nowhere, around 3500 BCE, with no slow evolution leading to them. Their language was fully formed, their city plans geometrically aligned, the astronomical charts already precise. They built temples, ziggurats, irrigation systems, and mathematical systems that still form the bones of our calendar today. It was as if the curtain had suddenly lifted on a civilization that began in full bloom, then faded as mysteriously as it has appeared. Scholars have long struggled to explain that suddenness. History prefers slow progress, gradual invention, one tool leading to the next. But the Sumerians complicate that rhythm. They spoke of a time before kings, before floods, when knowledge was given. They named their teachers not as men, but as gods descending from the sky. And though such language was later dressed in myth, its foundation feels older than metaphor. The clay doesn't lie. It remembers. Imagine holding one of those tablets, warm in your palm, its wedge-shaped impressions, still carrying the pulse of a hand that lived before every empire we know. The writing system, cuneiform, was not merely an alphabet but a geometry of meaning. Triangles, lines, and cuts, each arranged to hold both sound and symbol. Through these marks they recorded medicine, trade, hymns, contracts, and even star movements. One tablet lists the phases of Venus with a precision we only confirmed with modern telescopes. Another describes the paths of Jupiter and Mars, and then there are the stories of Enki and Enlil, of Anu, of creation molded from earth and divine essence. It's easy to dismiss mythology as invention, but when myth repeats the same pattern across continents, the silence between the lines begins to hum. The Sumerians spoke of a great deluge that ended an earlier world. The same story is found in Akkadian, Hebrew, Hindu, and even Mesoamerican texts. How could cultures separated by oceans remember the same catastrophe? Perhaps memory itself drifts like silt, settling wherever consciousness finds room. Or perhaps the ancients shared more than we allow ourselves to imagine. When archaeologists uncovered the city of Uruk, they expected crude beginnings. Instead, they found city walls stretching 6 miles, monumental temples aligned with celestial points, and evidence of advanced metallurgy. Buried beneath one ziggurat, they unearthed a library of over 40,000 clay tablets, a civilization that documented itself in extraordinary detail, yet left us with more questions than answers. How did they learn so much so quickly? Where did their mathematics, based on 60 not 10, come from? Why did they map the heavens with such familiarity, as though they were remembering rather than discovering? Some researchers suggest that Sumer arose from centuries of forgotten development, a lineage of small settlements lost to erosion and flood. Others whisper that the Sumerians inherited their knowledge from an even earlier people, one erased by the cataclysms that ended the last ice age. And then there are those who read the tablets literally, that the gods who descended from the sky were not divine in the spiritual sense, but teachers, travelers, or perhaps remnants of a civilization that predated us altogether. But even the skeptics admit something strange. The Sumerian timeline doesn't fit. Civilizations aren't supposed to emerge fully structured. Yet here, they did. Agriculture, writing, law, music, medicine, all at once. The clay tablets don't show trial and error, they show refinement. As though what we call the birth of civilization was to them a rebuilding. In the Museum of the Ancient Near East in Berlin, a small clay cylinder rests behind glass. The markings on its surface describe the building of a temple in honor of Inanna, the goddess of love and war. But among the dedication lines, one sentence stands out. This is the restoration of what was before. Restoration, a word that implies memory, not invention. It's a quiet confession that even the Sumerians saw themselves as heirs to something older. Sometimes, when you look closely at these artifacts, you notice fingerprints pressed into the clay before it dried, the print of a scribe who may have lived 6,000 years ago. A pulse frozen in mud, and if you trace that ridge with your eyes, you realize those hands might have written down the last surviving fragments of an age erased by flood, time, or perhaps intention. The silence between those lines feels heavy, as if something vast had been taken away. The same way a missing note can haunt an entire song, the same way a lost memory hovers at the edge of sleep. Maybe that's why these stories still whisper to us. They remind us that what we call history might only be the part that survived the burning. At night, when the museums close and the lights fade, I imagine those clay tablets breathing in the dark, each one holding the faint memory of a world we no longer recognize. We think we are the beginning of understanding, but maybe we are the last chapter of remembrance. And as the desert wind passes over the ruins of Uruk, carrying grains of ancient dust into another millennium, you can almost hear the first line of our forgotten story. Soft, unfinished, waiting to be heard again. If the Sumerians were not the first, then who are they remembering? They said kingship descended from heaven. Not metaphorically, not symbolically, but as a statement of fact. That single line, carved into clay more than 4,000 years ago, still trembles with something that language struggles to contain. After the kingship descended from heaven, kingship was in every dew. It is the opening verse of what we now call the Sumerian king list, a chronicle of rulers whose reigns stretch far beyond the boundaries of human possibility. On the surface, it reads like a historical document, cities, names, dates. But as the list continues, the numbers become impossible. One king ruled for 36,000 years, another for 28,100, another for 43,200.
In total, 8 rulers governed the world before a great flood swept over the land. Only after that flood does the record shrink into something more human, reigns of hundreds, then decades. Scholars have tried for centuries to decode what those impossible numbers mean. Were they symbolic, astronomical, allegorical? Or were they preserving a time when the scale of life itself was different? There's something unsettling in that question, something that makes the air around these tablets feel heavier. Because these weren't idle stories. They were bureaucratic records, written in the same hand that tallied grain, debts, and temple offerings. To the Sumerians, this list was memory, not myth, and that distinction haunts everything about it. The earliest copies were found in the ruins of Lhasa and Nippur. Each version differs slightly, as though translated from a memory that was already fading. Yet the structure remains constant. 8 kings before the flood, their reigns measured in tens of thousands of years, followed by a cosmic reset. Then new kings arise, Uruk, Kish, Ur, each claiming divine mandate, each tracing legitimacy back to that pre-Diluvian age. Some historians argue that these numbers reflect lunar cycles, or perhaps a symbolic calendar meant to convey divine authority. But others, those who linger too long on the strange precision of Sumerian mathematics, notice that the numbers correspond to multiples of 3600, the Sumerian unit known as the Sar. This wasn't random. It was the same system used to measure orbits, star cycles, and distances. Why would a royal chronicle be encoded in astronomical notation? Unless the kings themselves were meant to be read as celestial beings, rulers of epochs rather than years. The king list is one of those artifacts that feels like it shouldn't exist. It bridges myth and history so seamlessly that scholars still argue over which side it belongs to. The names of these ancient rulers, Alulim, Alalngar, and Menluana, don't appear anywhere else, and yet the cities they ruled do. Eridu, for instance, is real, considered by archaeologists to be the oldest city in southern Mesopotamia. Under its ruins, they've found layer upon layer of construction, dating back almost 8,000 years. Temples rebuilt upon older temples, each one slightly smaller than the one before, as if mimicking the slow contraction of time itself. The Sumerians called Eridu the first city. In their stories, it was founded by the god Enki, the keeper of knowledge, the one who shaped humanity from clay. Excavations there reveal evidence of a complex water system, ritual altars, and artifacts made of materials that shouldn't have existed in that region. Stones from distant mountains, shells from the Indian Ocean, a trade network or a remnant of something older, perhaps both. When the king list describes the flood that ended the reigns of the ancient kings, it uses language eerily similar to later texts. Then the flood swept over. No explanation, no divine judgment, just an event that resets time. Beneath ancient archaeologists in the 1920s uncovered a layer of clean, sterile silt, nearly 2 meters thick, evidence of a massive flood around 2900 BCE. It buried everything beneath it, sealing one age beneath another. It is tempting to read this as proof, though proof is never what these stories truly offer. They offer suggestion, shadow, memory. In the quiet of a museum, standing before the king list tablet, you might notice how deliberate each wedge mark is. There's no hesitation. Whoever wrote it believed in the precision of every number. And yet, it feels as though the writer was transcribing something even older, something handed down through generations that no longer understood its origin. The strangeness deepens when you realize that nearly every ancient culture shares an echo of this same sequence: divine rulers, catastrophic flood, new beginning. The Egyptian Turin Papyrus lists gods and demigods ruling before human pharaohs. The Hindu Puranas describe vast yugas, ages lasting tens of thousands of years ending in flood and fire. The Mayan Chilambalam speaks of earlier worlds destroyed by water and time. Always the same pattern: rule from the sky, a fall into chaos, rebirth through flood. It's as though humanity remembers the rhythm but not the melody. The details change, the names shift, yet the structure remains. A half-remembered dream repeated across continents. Some researchers, like Zechariah Sitchin, argued that the king list preserves a record of beings who weren't entirely human. Those who came from the stars taught humanity and ruled until the flood removed them. His interpretations, though controversial, found resonance because the questions the tablets raise refused to die. Even traditional archaeologists, while rejecting the extraterrestrial hypothesis, admit that the origin of Sumerian civilization is an anomaly, a spark without a match. Others see in the list an encoded scientific calendar. The long reigns may represent precession cycles or cosmic epochs. If the reign of Alulim lasted 2800 years, perhaps it marked a celestial alignment, a rhythm of the heavens mirrored on earth. The Sumerians often blurred the boundaries between sky and soil. Their gods were the planets themselves. their myths the language of orbit and light. Maybe the king list was less a record of rule and more a map of cosmic order, a record of the time before time. Still, the emotional weight of it cannot be ignored. Beneath all the numbers and theories, there is grief in these tablets, a sense that something magnificent once existed, and that everything after was merely its shadow. When the flood swept over, the old world died, and memory became myth. The Sumerians built their temples as acts of remembrance, not ambition. They were rebuilding, not beginning. You can almost hear that longing in their hymns, songs to gods who no longer answered, invocations to ancestors turned to dust. The king list might have been less a document of power than a prayer, a way to hold on to a world they could no longer see, a world that perhaps they themselves did not fully understand. In one of the surviving lines, after the flood, the text reads simply, "Then kingship was again lowered from heaven," as if history itself is cyclical, descending and withdrawing like the tide. Each age, each civilization, each rise and fall, just another attempt to remember what was lost the first time. Perhaps that's why we still search the desert for their traces, not to find answers, but to feel that rhythm again, the slow pulse of a world older than history. If time began once before, could it begin again? There is a quiet kind of awe that comes from realizing how much the ancients knew about the sky, not as an abstraction, not as a canvas of wonder, but as a system they seem to have already mapped long before telescopes existed. The Sumerians didn't just look upward, they measured, recorded, and aligned their world according to what they saw. Their temples were built in exact orientation with celestial paths. Their gods were the planets. Their calendar followed the intricate rhythms of Venus and Jupiter with a precision we would only rediscover thousands of years later.
And somehow, this knowledge appeared not at the end of a long learning curve, but at the very beginning. If you walk among the ruins of Ural Nippa and stand where the ziggurats once reached toward the horizon, the geometry of their foundations reveals something uncanny. Every major temple faces an astronomical point, the rising of a particular star, the solstice line, the place where Venus appears at dawn. The great ziggurat of Ur, for example, is aligned almost perfectly to the north, with corners facing the cardinal directions, a feat of architectural awareness that implies both mathematical skill and celestial observation. Yet these structures were built nearly 6,000 years ago, at a time when most of the world still lived in scattered tribes. Among the thousands of tablets excavated from Mesopotamia, a small subset records something unexpected. Systematic star charts, the so-called MUL, Apin tablets, believed to date from the Old Babylonian period but preserving far older Sumerian knowledge, list constellations, equinoxes, solstices, and the rising and setting times of the planets. Some scholars believe the observations encoded there could date back to around 3000 BCE, possibly earlier. How could they know the exact cycle of Venus, 580th Trui 92 days, with an error margin of less than a single day? Modern science, with all its instruments, calculates the precession of the equinox at roughly 1 degree every 72 years. But in ancient Sumer, inscriptions already reflect an understanding of this slow drift of the stars. To measure that, one would need centuries of continuous observation, or inherited records from a civilization that had already observed them. The Sumerians left us neither telescopes nor formal explanations, only myth. But their myths speak in the language of data. The goddess Inanna, associated with Venus, was said to descend into the underworld and rise again, her story mirroring the planet's disappearance and reappearance in the sky. The god Nana, the moon, was the keeper of cycles, his temple the great observatory of Ur. The 7 great gods corresponded to the 7 classical planets. Even the term Anunnaki, often translated as those who from heaven to earth came, carries a double resonance. Mythological beings, yes, but also the counted ones of Arnu, a phrase that in Sumerian also means the numbered heavenly bodies. It is tempting to read too much into coincidence, yet the consistency of these patterns across cities and epochs suggests intent, not accident. Each temple, each ritual, each festival date reflected the turning of the heavens. They didn't separate religion from science or myth from observation. For them, the universe was a single breathing system, its motions sacred, its numbers divine. But where did this awareness begin? Did a people just emerging from the Neolithic Revolution truly develop such refined astronomy alone? In 1899, the German archaeologist Hugo Winkler uncovered tablets at Boğazköy in Anatolia, texts that linked Sumerian star lore to the later Hittites and Chaldeans. What's striking is the continuity. The same constellations, the same patterns of planetary worship, transmitted for millennia with barely any change. Such precision doesn't usually survive oral tradition. It survives through written record or preserved systems of instruction, which means the Sumerians were not inventing astronomy. They were documenting something already known. In one tablet from Nineveh's library, now kept in the British Museum, a scribe had carefully drawn the path of Jupiter across the night sky, using a complex mathematical system that modern astronomers recognized as a rudimentary form of calculus. Another tablet describes the shadow of the Earth across the moon during an eclipse, noting that the god is devoured but returns. Beneath the poetry lies recognition of orbit and geometry. And when these same scribes referred to the heavens as the tablets of destiny, they weren't being poetic. They were speaking the literal truth of their worldview, that the stars recorded. There's something almost eerie in that. A civilization born out of mud and reed huts, whose farmers depended on the flooding of rivers, writing about the mathematical precision of the cosmos, as if they had already mastered it. And maybe, in a sense, they had. Some researchers see in their 12-base numbering system a reflection of the 12 major constellations of the zodiac, the division of the sky that we still use today. Others point to the Sumerian obsession with the number 60, found everywhere in their measurements, as evidence of astronomical encoding: 60 minutes, 60 seconds, 360 degrees. Even our modern clocks still echo their design. The very rhythm of our timekeeping is inherited from theirs. And then there are the stories that unsettle even the most cautious scholars. In a series of tablets from Sippar, the god Enki instructs humankind in the measures of the heavens, teaching them to build instruments to see that which cannot be seen. Another fragment describes a chamber of glass that magnifies the eyes. Some interpret this as metaphor, others as lost technology, a poetic memory of lenses or primitive telescopes. Indeed, small rock crystal lenses are being found in Mesopotamian sites, though their purpose remains debated. Were they ornaments or tools of observation? The more we read, the harder it becomes to separate their cosmology from ours. The Sumerians didn't just watch the sky. They believed it was alive. Each planet had a will, a personality, an orbit that mirrored moral order. The movement of the stars was not mechanical but spiritual, yet their records of it remain mathematically consistent. Somehow, they managed to hold myth and measurement in the same breath without contradiction. Maybe that's what modernity lost, the ability to see precision and wonder as one thing. If we could ask a Sumerian priest astronomer how he knew what he knew, he might simply say, "It was given." And perhaps he would not mean by gods of flesh or fire, but by the universe itself, something received through observation, ritual, patience, and memory. Yet even that explanation leaves something unspoken, because their knowledge feels too vast for their context, too deliberate for mere chance. Was this the residue of a forgotten epoch, an inheritance from people who'd already charted the heavens before the flood? Or is it simply proof that humanity's genius has always been older than we imagine? Either way, when the sun sets over the ruins of Ur, when the first stars ignite over the desert. It's easy to believe the Sumerians are still watching. Their geometry remains etched into the earth. The angles of their temples still catch the light of the same stars they once recorded. Their myths still move with the rhythm of planetary orbits, and somewhere in that rhythm lies a memory of a time when science and divinity were the same language. The gods who measured the heavens may have been only men, or perhaps the men who watched the heavens became gods in the act of measuring. If they inherited their knowledge, then from whom? Among the broken foundations of ancient Sumer, between fragments of brick and scorched clay, archaeologists have found something quietly astonishing. Evidence of technology that should not exist at the dawn of civilization, tools of bronze appearing before the Bronze Age, geometrically precise drilling on diorite stone, clay tablets describing complex mixtures of minerals and metals. Even the very word they use for knowledge, did not mean learning in the way we understand it. It meant something closer to codes, formulas, or fundamental laws of order. To the Sumerians, science was not invention, it was memory. When the excavations at Eridunia uncovered tablets detailing the building of ziggurats, researchers expected primitive blueprints, rough sketches of mud and reed structures. Instead, they found measurements, proportional ratios, and angles described in base 60 mathematics, the same system we still use to measure circles and time. Their architects calculated volumes, slopes, and weight distribution with eerie precision, suggesting a practical understanding of geometry centuries before the Greeks would give it a name. It is as if they had inherited an engineer's handbook from a vanished source, one they could follow but perhaps no longer fully explain. Even in daily life, their scientific awareness was woven into everything. Farmers recorded the phases of the moon to predict irrigation cycles. Physicians catalogued symptoms and treatments on tablets that read like early pharmacopoeia. One tablet from Nippur lists over 200 medicinal plants, categorized by function. Another describes the mixing of sulfur, copper, and oil to create compounds used in rituals of purification, formulas that resemble primitive chemistry. There are even mentions of something called nigigar, translated as the shining liquid, which some think refers to distilled mercury, though such a material should not have been known in that age. These echoes of forgotten science grow louder the deeper one looks. Take metallurgy. By 3000 BCE, Sumerians were smelting copper and experimenting with alloys. Yet in the ruins of Telsmar and Kish, metallurgists have found traces of hardened bronze predating this timeline, metal that suggests an earlier, more advanced understanding of smelting. In the same region, cylindrical seals depict saws, drills, and bellows. It is not evidence of machines as we know them, but it implies that their craftsmanship reached a sophistication unexplained by the tools archaeologists have recovered. Then there is mathematics itself, the language of their world. The base 60 system they used allowed fractions, astronomical divisions, and calculations of time far beyond the needs of simple agriculture. To divide the heavens into 360 degrees, to measure an hour into 60 minutes, demands not imagination but precedent. Some historians argue that their system must have evolved from long observation, perhaps over millennia. Others whisper that such precision arrived ready-made, the relic of an earlier epoch. A few scholars have gone further still. In the 1920s, the Assyriologist Georges Roux suggested that Sumerian technical vocabulary contained loanwords from a non-Semitic, non-known language, traces of an extinct scientific lexicon. He called it the substrate of invention. We do not know who spoke it, only that its remnants survive like fossils embedded within Sumerian speech. Perhaps those words belong to the very civilization the Sumerians claim to remember, the one before the flood. To modern ears, this sounds like mythologizing, but myth has a strange habit of preserving technical truth in symbolic form. Consider the god Enki, lord of the deep waters and keeper of wisdom. In the myth of Enki and Inanna, he sends the me of civilization, a series of tablets containing the codes for music, architecture, law, and crafts. Each me is a principle, a formula. When Inanna carries them to her city, civilization itself awakens. The story is spiritual but also curiously literal. It describes the transmission of knowledge, as if from an older source to a younger one. The gods are not inventors, they are custodians. That word, custodian, may hold the key. The Sumerians never claimed ownership of their sciences. They described themselves as receivers, stewards of gifts from heaven. Their scribes learned geometry and astronomy not as human achievements, but as divine inheritance. And in their rituals, to teach or recite knowledge was to reenact creation itself, a reminder that wisdom must be preserved, not invented. We might be tempted to see their science as accidental genius, a coincidence of clever farmers and observant priests. Yet there are details that resist simplicity. In 1936, archaeologists unearthed a clay tablet from Sippar containing a list of geometric problems that included the calculation of a right-angled triangle, using what would later be known as the Pythagorean theorem, over 1,000 years before Pythagoras. Another tablet, from the same site, outlines the formula for measuring the area of a circle with remarkable accuracy. These are not the fumblings of a beginning mind. They are the remnants of a system already refined. Even their art hides mathematical secrets. The dimensions of their statues often conformed harmonic ratios, the same proportional systems later celebrated in classical Greek sculpture. The temples of Uruk and Eridu are constructed on scales of 3-4-5, the simplest form of right-angle proportion. It is as though they understood that beauty, structure, and sound were all manifestations of the same universal pattern. The echoes stretch beyond Mesopotamia. Around the same centuries across the sea, the builders of Egypt's earliest temples were using similar measurements. In the Indus Valley, city plans followed strict geometric grids. In each region, the earliest phase of civilization appears not crude but deliberate, as if responding to a memory that transcended geography. Scholars call this the synchronization problem, the improbable simultaneity of complex urban design around 3000 BCE. Why did humanity begin building with mathematical consciousness all at once? Why not earlier or later? Some argue that this reflects a shared awakening of the human mind, a threshold crossed when language, observation, and symbolic thought converged. Others sense in it the residue of something that came before, a common inheritance, scattered and remembered differently by each culture. Perhaps it was not that Sumer, Egypt, and the Indus Valley discovered civilization separately, but that they each rediscovered fragments of an older blueprint. The Sumerians themselves seem to believe that. In their hymns, the first city, Eridu, is described as raised from the clay of the deep, its foundations older than the sky. The god Enki's temple there, the Iabzu, was said to sit above the waters of wisdom that flowed from the underworld. Metaphor, yes, but also an image of continuity. Knowledge surfacing from the depths of time. Even their mythology of sound carries echoes of scientific order. The word Enlil, often translated as Lord of the Air, can also mean the vibration that moves through space. In ritual chants, priests invoked him as the breath that shapes the world, the invisible force that structures matter. To modern ears, it sounds eerily like a poetic understanding of frequency and resonance, the physics of vibration encoded in sacred language. If these parallels are coincidence, they are profound ones, and yet, coincidence or not, the impression remains that the earliest civilization we know was not struggling toward knowledge, but struggling to remember it. Each equation, each temple, each tablet feels like an echo, a reverberation from something older. We live surrounded by the remnants of their systems. Every time we tell time, every time we divide a circle, every time we measure, we are repeating the logic of their world. They are still teaching us, though their names have crumbled to dust. Perhaps civilization doesn't begin when we invent knowledge. Perhaps it begins when we rediscover it, when the silence of forgetting breaks and an echo returns. But if Sumer remembered what had come before, what catastrophe had erased the world they were trying so carefully to rebuild? If one listens long enough, even clay begins to speak, buried beneath centuries of wind and silence. The tablets of Nippur and Nineveh form what might be the oldest libraries in human history, archives of law, medicine, astronomy, and ritual. Yet they are more than collections of knowledge. They are the fossilized memory of a civilization that seemed desperate to preserve what it knew. When these tablets were first unearthed, they shattered the illusion that ancient people lived in ignorance. Instead, they revealed a world of scribes, scholars, and thinkers who wrote as if they were racing against oblivion. The city of Nippur was not a royal capital. It had no king, no armies, no empire. And yet it was the spiritual heart of Sumer, home to the great temple of Enlil, the Lord of the Wind. Beneath its ruins, archaeologists uncovered tens of thousands of clay tablets, an ancient archive so vast that scholars are still deciphering fragments today. What they found changed everything. There were administrative lists, yes, but also poems, star maps, surgical instructions, even philosophical reflections on fate and justice. Some of these texts predate the Bible by more than a millennium, yet they contain thoughts so familiar that they feel almost modern. Imagine standing in one of those rooms, the air thick with the scent of baked clay. Rows upon rows of tablets line the shelves, each one pressed with the angled marks of cuneiform, each one a voice preserved. The scribes of Nippur were not mere record keepers. They were guardians of continuity. In their schools, young apprentices learned not only to read and write, but to memorize entire catalogs of signs, hundreds, sometimes thousands of them. Learning to write in Sumer was an initiation into a secret order, an act of devotion as much as intellect. The clay tablet was their sacred object, their bridge to the past. The sheer range of subjects preserved there is staggering. One tablet details a code of ethics for physicians. Do not cause harm by your hand. Do not withhold the remedy. Another describes the structure of the liver in the practice of divination, a proto-anatomical observation encoded in ritual language. Others list mineral substances used in dyes and medicines. Even more surprising are the astronomical records, the risings of stars, the movements of the moon, and the prediction of eclipses. For a civilization we call the first, their intellectual horizon was already immense. When the great flood of history finally drowned Sumer cities, through war, erosion, and time, Nippur's tablets survived because they were clay. Fire and burial preserved them where papyrus and parchment would have turned to dust. And so, thousands of years later, when Austin Henry Layard and Hormuzd Rassam began to dig at Nineveh in the mid-1800s, they stumbled upon something even greater, the library of Ashurbanipal, king of Assyria. That library, though built more than 1,000 years after Nippur's golden age, was its heir. Within its walls, the Assyrian scribes had gathered and copied Sumerian and Babylonian texts, over 30,000 tablets in total. When the palace burned, the heat hardened them into permanence. The result was an archive of cosmic scope, preserving stories, calculations, and incantations that would otherwise have vanished forever. Among them were fragments of the Epic of Gilgamesh, the flood narrative that predated Genesis. There were omens, star catalogs, dream manuals, hymns to Inanna and Enki, and lists of kings stretching back into myth. Reading those tablets now, one feels a strange mixture of gratitude and sorrow. Gratitude that the fire saved them. Sorrow that the civilization they recorded was already fading when the copies were made. The scribes of Nineveh worked like archaeologists of their own past, preserving texts they themselves could barely understand. One colophon reads, "From the old tablets, damaged, restored with care." Another tablet bears the quiet signature of a scribe. I have written what was left to me. Those words echo across the centuries like a lament. They knew they were writing at the end of something. The content of these libraries hints at an intellectual lineage that defies simple categorization. In the Enuma and the Enlil series, thousands of lines devoted to celestial omens, each movement of a planet, each halo around the moon was recorded and interpreted as a reflection of divine will. Behind the poetry, however, lies systematic observation, data spanning generations. The Sumerians and their eras were scientists in priestly robes, mathematicians speaking in myth. They didn't separate the physical from the sacred. For them, to measure the heavens was to converse with the gods. One of the most haunting discoveries in Nineveh's archive is the so-called Tablet of the Great Flood. It tells of a man chosen to survive the deluge, commanded by a god to build a vessel and preserve life. The parallels to Noah's story are unmistakable, but this version is older, perhaps the original. The flood, it says, swept over like a wind, erasing kings and cities alike. When the waters receded, kingship descended again from heaven. The cycle resumed. The story is both myth and record, memory and metaphor. It is easy to read these texts as distant curiosities, but they were not written for us. They were written for continuity, for a future they hoped would still understand. Each tablet was a time capsule, a plea against erasure. The scribes must have known that empires fall and tongues vanish. They wrote anyway, trusting clay more than stone. And perhaps they were right. Because long after their cities collapsed, their words endure. The numerals define our clocks. The geometry shapes our buildings. The myths live in our religions. Even their fears of flood, of forgetting, remain ours. Every modern library is, in a sense, a descendant of Nippur and Nineveh, each shelf a new stratum of clay. But there's another layer to this story, one rarely spoken aloud. Some fragments from these ancient libraries describe devices, instruments, and processes that seem out of place in their time. One tablet speaks of a vessel of shining copper that stores the fire of heaven. Another mentions the crystal that brings light to darkness. Scholars interpret these as metaphors for ritual objects. Yet one wonders, were they metaphors, or faint echoes of lost technologies whose purposes we can no longer imagine? Even their writing system feels like a machine of preservation. Cuneiform could record both sound and idea, a hybrid code that could survive translation. It was robust, adaptable, modular. When the Greeks later adopted the concept of the written archive, they did so under the shadow of Nineveh's example. The library, as an idea, began in Sumer. Standing before those tablets today, under the sterile light of museums, it is difficult not to feel the pull of that ancient intention, to remember. They knew knowledge could vanish. They saw it happen before. Perhaps that's why they wrote so obsessively, so completely. Every wedge in clay was an act of defiance against the flood. But if the Sumerians and their heirs were merely preserving what they already knew, what then had they lost? What deeper archive lies still buried beneath the layers of time, waiting for another civilization to find it, to read, to wonder, and to ask the same unanswerable question? In the oldest stories ever written, humanity is not born, it is made. The Sumerians told of gods who labored to shape the world, and of a moment when they grew weary of their endless toil. It was then they said that Enki, the god of wisdom, and Ninhursag, the lady of life, gathered the essence of the divine and mixed it with the clay of the earth. From this fusion came the first humans, Lulu Amilu, servants who could bear the burdens of creation. It is a tale half myth, half memory, yet behind its poetry hides something more, an idea so ancient and so radical that it still unsettles us, that life itself may be the result of design. The Atrahasis epic, carved into tablets long before the book of Genesis, describes the gods' assembly. Enlil, their leader, laments the noise of the lesser beings who labor in the fields. Enki offers a solution. they will fashion a new race to work in their stead. But the raw clay alone is lifeless. To animate it, they need something of themselves. So they sacrifice a god, his blood mixed with the earth, his spirit divided among humankind. And thus, through an act of divine transgression, we are born both mortal and sacred, both servant and heir. It is an origin that feels older than any religion, part biology, part mystery. What were the Sumerians trying to tell us? Did they imagine this story as pure allegory, or were they recording something remembered from a time so far removed that it could only survive in mythic form? Archaeologists have long treated such tales as metaphors for the dawn of civilization, the moment when humanity learned agriculture, law, and writing. But what if the story's deeper meaning is literal in ways we can no longer see? The phrase, mixed with the blood of the gods, appears again and again across Mesopotamian texts. In Akkadian, Zima Ilani, the genetic essence of the divine, was described as a life-bearing fluid, a seed of heaven. The same idea echoes in Egypt, in Greece, in the Hebrew Bible. The human body, they believed, carried fragments of something older, something celestial. Modern readers tend to separate myth from science. Yet when one looks closely, the distance between them narrows. The Sumerians described a process of creation that involves the manipulation of flesh and blood, matter infused with intention. In the myth of Enki and Ninmah, the gods experiment repeatedly, creating beings that fail, one blind, one mute, one unable to reproduce, until finally they succeed. The story reads like an ancient parable of trial and error, a poetic reflection of some forgotten knowledge of human anatomy or heredity. Perhaps not literal experimentation, but a symbol of that haunting intuition that life is the product of sequence, of design. Scholars who've studied the Sumerian corpus note how often their texts speak of templates, the me, as blueprints for both physical and moral reality. Every element of existence, from kingship to weaving to fertility, was said to have its own me, a divine formula that kept the cosmos in balance. To possess the me was to possess the power of creation itself. When Inanna stole these tablets from Enki, chaos spread through the world, not because she defied the gods, but because she disrupted the code that sustained life. The language of myth begins to sound almost computational, as though the ancients saw reality as a system governed by hidden instructions. In another fragmentary text, the god Enki instructs his priest to guard the blood that makes the clay speak. That line, enigmatic and strange, lingers like an echo of biochemical truth. Blood indeed carries language of its own, DNA, the molecular code that dictates life's form. Could it be that what we read as divine metaphor once described an ancient insight, one lost through time? Not knowledge of molecules or genetics as we know them, but an intuitive awareness that life's structure resides within blood, within pattern. Of course, such speculation unsettles historians, yet it is impossible to ignore the pattern. Civilizations across the ancient world share this same imagery, the mixing of heaven and earth, the creation of man from divine matter. The Egyptians said humanity was formed from the tears of Ra. The Greeks spoke of Prometheus shaping man from clay. The Hebrews echoed Summa almost word for word. God formed man from the dust of the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life. Story migrated, transformed, survived. But its core remained, the mingling of dust and spirit, matter and code. What does it mean that the oldest written civilization begins with such a story? Perhaps it was simply a way to explain consciousness, to reconcile the human desire for purpose with the reality of toil. Or perhaps it was a memory, handed down through floods and ruins, a recollection of a time when beings older than us walked the earth. The Sumerians called them Anunnaki, those who came from the heavens. In later Babylonian texts, these gods were said to teach humanity agriculture, astronomy, and metallurgy. To others, they are mythic archetypes. To some, they are the forgotten teachers of prehistory. In one hymn from Nippur, the poet writes, "O Enki, who mixed the essence of heaven with the clay of the Abzu, who gave to man the image of the gods." The phrase image of the gods, Salmi Ilani, carries the same resonance as the later Hebrew Telem Elohim. Could the Sumerian idea of divine image have been the original seed from which that later concept grew? The parallels are too precise to dismiss as coincidence. What we call theology may, at its roots, be the language of remembrance. There's also the recurring symbol of the tree, the sacred axis linking heaven, earth, and the underworld. On many Sumerian seals, figures stand beside a stylized tree, flanked by winged beings offering vessels of water or life. The icon repeats from Mesopotamia to Persia to Egypt, even to the Indus Valley. Some interpret it as the tree of life, others as a genetic emblem, a symbol of lineage. Either way, it represents continuity, a bridge between divine and mortal. Perhaps that is what the blood of the gods truly meant. A metaphor for consciousness itself, the spark that connects flesh to eternity. And yet, there is melancholy in this myth, for the same gods who created humanity also cursed them with mortality. To be made from divine blood was to contain divinity, but also to be forever cut off from it. The story of Enki's creation is one of both gift and exile. We are children of the divine and prisoners of matter. Every Sumerian prayer, every lamentation carries that tone of yearning, for return, for reunion, for remembrance. If their myths were indeed memories, then perhaps they were mourning a separation that once occurred, a fall not of sin, but of knowledge. Something was divided long ago, and ever since we have tried to piece it back together. Each age rediscovers fragments, the laws of physics, the secrets of life, and calls it progress. But maybe it is only recollection. In the end, the Sumerians saw no conflict between creation and science, between gods and clay. They saw only one story, endlessly retold, the universe awakening to itself through the vessel of flesh. The blood of the gods flows in us still, they would have said, not as a myth but as a reminder that our origins are both earthly and cosmic, both known and forgotten. If the first humans were born from the mingling of heaven and earth, what happens when the blood of the gods remembers what it once was? There is a strange quiet that follows catastrophe, a silence so complete that even memory hesitates to speak. The Sumerians knew that silence well. They called it the day the water swept over the land. To them, it was not merely a storm or a flood. It was the erasure of a world, the cleansing of an age that had grown too loud, too full of its own creations. What remained after was not just ruin, but amnesia. Humanity began again, they said, smaller, humbler, haunted by echoes of what came before. In the Epic of Ziusudra, one of the earliest flood narratives known to humankind, the story unfolds in fragments, carved into clay sometime around 1700 BCE, but rooted in far older oral memory. The gods, disturbed by humanity's noise, decree destruction. Only Ziusudra, a king and priest of the city of Shuruppak, receives a whisper of warning from the god Enki. Build a vessel, Enki tells him, of strong walls and sealed pitch, take into it the seed of all living things. Then the rain begins, not gentle but endless. The rivers rise, the sea swallows the plains, and the horizon dissolves into water. For 7 days and nights, the world vanishes beneath the flood. When the waters recede, Ziusudra opens a window and releases a dove. It does not return. He knows the earth has emerged again. In gratitude, he offers sacrifice. The gods, moved or perhaps regretful, grant him immortality and place him in the land beyond the rivers. This story predates the biblical flood by over a millennium. Its bones are the same: divine wrath, chosen survivor, vessel of life, renewal. Yet the Sumerian version carries no moral lesson. no condemnation. It reads instead like a geological memory, a record of an event so profound that it burned itself into the human timeline. Archaeology, cautious as ever, hesitates to affirm such myths. And yet, beneath the ruins of ancient Mesopotamian cities, there is evidence that something like the Sumerian flood did happen. In the 1920s, Sir Leonard Woolley excavated and discovered a deep, sterile layer of silt, clean river mud nearly 2 meters thick, sandwiched between layers of habitation. He found similar deposits at Kish and Shurapak. The dating corresponded roughly to 2900 BCE. Woolley described it simply: a flood of such magnitude that it destroyed life and left the land empty. The people who rebuilt afterward did so as if they were starting anew. To modern minds, it may sound like coincidence, one local disaster among many. But to those who lived it, it must have felt like the end of the world. The rivers Tigris and Euphrates, swollen by rains and melting snows, may have combined with tidal surges from the Persian Gulf. Or perhaps the memory reaches even farther back, to the violent end of the last ice age, when meltwater floods reshaped entire continents. In every corner of the ancient world, the same pattern persists: myths of great waters, survivors in boats, the rebirth of humankind. From India's Manu to the Greek Deucalion, from the Aztec Cox to the biblical Noah, the story repeats like a scar in the collective mind. The Sumerians, though, described it not merely as disaster, but as transition. The flood was the dividing line between the antediluvian kings, those mysterious rulers who reigned for tens of thousands of years, and the mortal kings who came after. It was the veil between myth and history. Before the flood, the gods walked openly among men. Afterward, they withdrew. The connection between heaven and earth was severed. Humanity was left to remember and to misremember. Some tablets hint that the flood was not entirely natural. In one fragment, the gods debate among themselves: should humankind be destroyed? Enlil, weary of the noise of cities, argues for annihilation. Enki pleads for mercy, seeking another way. It is a dialogue of opposing forces: order and compassion, control and chaos. When the deluge comes, it feels less like accident and more like decision. The phrase used to describe it, the great decree, suggests intention. The flood was not just water, it was judgment. Others have seen in this story traces of something even more complex, a metaphor for cycles of civilization. Perhaps the flood was not a literal inundation, but a symbolic description of an event that reset human culture. A comet impact, a shift in climate, a collapse of knowledge. Geological evidence hints at sudden sea level rises and cosmic impacts near the end of the Pleistocene. To the survivors, it would have seemed divine punishment, incomprehensible power. And so they remembered it as a cleansing, one that washed away both sin and science. If the flood erased a former world, then every artifact the Sumerians later buried was a fragment of that forgotten age. Their writing, their mathematics, their star charts, each feels like an attempt to retrieve something half-remembered. They were not inventing civilization, they were rebuilding after the water. Even their myths read like recovery manuals. The god Enki, savior of humanity, teaches the survivors how to plant, how to measure, how to keep time. Knowledge in their view was not discovery, but restoration. In the poem, The Return of Inanna, the goddess descends to the underworld and rises again after 3 days, bringing fertility back to the land. The Sumerians may have seen the flood in similar terms: descent into chaos, return to life. Yet beneath the spiritual allegory lingers a geological memory. Something happened, something vast enough to fracture both land and legend. There is a line from the Epic of Gilgamesh that feels almost like confession. Utnapishtim, a flood survivor, tells Gilgamesh, "What you call the gods were once men of great name. They remembered the secrets of the deep. It is a strange sentence, one that suggests that divinity and humanity are not separate species but states of memory. The flood did not just drown the earth, it drowned that memory. What remained was the echo. Even today, when rain falls over the plains of southern Iraq, it is said that the soil releases a faint metallic scent, as though the ground itself recalls the sea that once covered it. In that scent lies the residue of the ancient catastrophe, the flood that ended an era and began another, and perhaps the Sumerian sense that such cycles never truly end. Every civilization, no matter how advanced, eventually meets its flood, whether of water, fire, or forgetfulness. To the ancients, survival was not victory, it was responsibility. Ziusudra was not rewarded with paradise but exile, sent to dwell in the distance, to remember what others would forget. The flood was both punishment and preservation, ensuring that at least one thread of memory would remain. That thread wound its way into every myth that followed, binding the ages together like sedimentary layers of story. When the Sumerians wrote of the deluge, they weren't warning us. They were reminding themselves that the gods, or perhaps nature itself, always demands silence after too much noise, and in that silence, humanity must learn again how to begin. If every age is washed away to make room for the next, then what will be the flood that erases us, and who will be left to remember what we once knew? Sometimes, what survives the flood is not the body, but the memory. The Sumerians believed that knowledge could drown and still return, hidden in fragments scattered across the world. They called such remnants shuba, meaning pieces of the whole. To them, these fragments were more than relics. They were the fingerprints of the world that had come before the waters. And as centuries passed, each new discovery unearthed in the soil of Mesopotamia, Anatolia, and the mountains beyond seemed to whisper the same unsettling message. Something had existed before them. Something both immense and forgotten. When explorers first began unearthing ancient sites across the Near East in the 19th century, they were not only finding cities, they were finding anomalies, objects that did not belong to their assigned ages, technologies that seemed misplaced, artifacts whose origins no one could explain. In the ruins of Nineveh and Uruk, they found gears carved into stone, lenses ground from quartz, and sculptures depicting figures in intricate robes patterned with symbols that did not correspond to any known writing system. Most of these finds were quietly removed to museum vaults, labeled as curiosities or mistakes. Yet a few, just a few, found their way into the literature of archaeology, sparking controversies that have never truly ended. In the 1930s, reports emerged of a small egg-shaped object unearthed near Baghdad. Made of terracotta and capped with a copper cylinder, it seemed to contain traces of acid corrosion. Some researchers proposed it could generate an electric charge, a primitive battery, 2,000 years older than it should have been. Others dismissed it as coincidence, a vessel of ritual or storage. But the possibility remains that the ancients may have known ways to harness forces we only rediscovered millennia later. Even now, it sits behind glass in the Baghdad Museum, its function unresolved, its silence heavier than explanation. There are other whispers. In Turkey's Anatolian highlands, far from Sumer, a site called Göbekli Tepe reveals megalithic pillars carved with animals and celestial symbols more than 11,000 years old, 6,000 years before Sumer's rise. The site predates agriculture, yet its builders arranged stones weighing tons into geometric enclosures aligned with the stars. No writing, no metal, no cities, yet an understanding of astronomy and engineering that seems out of place. Archaeologists call it the first temple, but to the Sumerians, who emerged long after, such a site would have been described another way, a remnant from before the flood. And in the caves of northern Iraq, at Shanidar, skeletons have been found buried with flowers, evidence of ritual, of consciousness, stretching back to the Neanderthals. The layers of humanity overlap here like sedimentary time, each one preserving a different kind of knowledge. The deeper the dig, the older the sophistication becomes. It is as if civilization did not climb a ladder but drifted in waves, rising, drowning, resurfacing. Among Sumerian scholars, there has always lingered a theory, unspoken but persistent, that their civilization's sudden appearance was not spontaneous but inherited. Their myths say as much. After the flood, Enki gives to the survivors, the black-headed people, the tools of life: writing, measurement, agriculture, and law. He does not invent these things, he restores them. The very language of Sumer hints at this restoration. Words for creation often derive from roots meaning to reawaken or to rebuild. Theirs was a civilization of remembering, not beginning. Archaeological layers support this intuition. Beneath the oldest known cities of Sumer, Eridu, Ur, Uruk, lie still older layers of habitation washed by ancient silt. Radiocarbon dates suggest settlements there more than 8,000 years old, predating the so-called birth of civilization. In some strata, tools appear that should not exist: advanced metallurgy, fine ceramics, architectural precision. None of it fits neatly within the model of linear progress. Instead, it suggests a broken timeline, a prehistory erased, then half recovered. Every culture inherits its ghosts. For the Sumerians, those ghosts were the gods themselves. The Anunnaki were not worshipped as distant deities but remembered as teachers, those who had walked among humans before the flood. In hymn after hymn they are called lords of wisdom, builders of cities, those who measured the dark waters. Some modern interpreters have tried to recast them as mythic archetypes, psychological symbols of knowledge. But in the cuneiform lines the tone is different. These were recollections, not allegories. The Sumerians spoke of them with the language one uses for ancestors, not abstractions. In one particularly haunting tablet from Nippur, the scribe records a vision. I saw the stone temples of the deep, their doors sealed by the waters. I saw lights beneath the sea that never fade. Scholars translate it as metaphor, but its imagery echoes across mythologies. The submerged realms, the lost cities, the knowledge beneath the waves. The Greeks called it Atlantis. The Egyptians spoke of Zep Tepi, the first time. The Sumerians simply called it before the flood. Perhaps they were all remembering the same event, fragmented through the lenses of geography and time. Some geologists now suggest that such a flood did indeed occur, around 12,000 years ago, when glacial melt caused catastrophic sea level rise and submerged vast coastlines. Entire cultures, if they existed there, would have been erased, leaving only memories passed down through survivors who rebuilt inland. Could the builders of Göbekli Tepe have been among them? Could their descendants have carried fragments of that vanished science into Sumer, Egypt, and beyond? The evidence is circumstantial, but the pattern persists. Civilization appears not as invention, but as rediscovery. There are artifacts that seem to confirm this continuity, but most remain controversial. In Iraq and Iran, archaeologists have found drill holes in diorite, one of the hardest stones on Earth, smooth and precise, as though made by rotary tools. In Egypt, identical markings appear on granite and basalt. The same techniques, the same signatures, separated by thousands of miles. Coincidence, perhaps, or memory, an ancient technology surviving through fragments of craft. Even language carries traces of this inheritance. The Sumerian word ti means both life and rib. In their creation myth, woman is made from the rib of the first man, an image that later appears in Genesis. But ti also means to repair. Thus woman is not a creation but a restoration, a fragment made whole again. The play of meanings reveals the deeper Sumerian view. Life itself is the process of repair, of remembering what was lost. The same principle seems to guide their temples and ziggurats. Each was built as a replica of a heavenly structure, a model of what already existed in the realm of the gods. To build, for the Sumerian, was to rebuild. Even the measurements of their temples were described as according to the plan written in the stars. It is a line both poetic and precise, for they believed the gods had left the blueprint of the world not on paper, but in the sky. If we follow that idea further, it begins to sound less like theology and more like a scientific philosophy. What if every discovery humanity makes is not creation, but a remembrance? Each age, in its turn, finds a fragment, one piece of the greater whole, and believes it new. The Sumerians might have smiled at this illusion, for they saw time not as a straight line but as a wheel. What was drowned will rise again. The flood did not erase everything. It buried the body of a lost world, but not its bones. Those bones, artifacts, stories, words still surface, carried by the slow current of time. The question is not whether that earlier world existed, but how much of it we are willing to recognize when we see it reflected in our own. If every fragment points towards something greater, some hidden pattern of memory, then how much of our own civilization is built upon foundations we no longer remember? Every civilization leaves a trace of its voice, and yet the voice of Sumer stands alone, untethered to any other tongue. Linguists call Sumerian a language isolate, a term that sounds clinical, but what it really means is this: it should not exist. Every known language, from the ancient Akkadian to the tongues we speak today, fits into a family tree. But Sumerian has no family, no known ancestor, no living descendants. It appeared fully formed, like its civilization, and vanished just as suddenly. And in that disappearance lies one of the oldest mysteries in human history. When scholars first began to decipher cuneiform in the 19th century, they assumed old Mesopotamian tablets were written in Akkadian, the Semitic language of Babylon. But as they worked, they found inscriptions whose grammar and structure defied logic. The verbs didn't conjugate like Akkadian ones. The syntax was reversed. Words seemed to fuse and break apart without pattern. Eventually they realized they were reading something far older, a hidden layer beneath the Akkadian texts. They named it Sumerian, after the land of Sumer, the first kingdom of recorded time. Yet even after a century of study, no one truly understands where it came from. Linguists have searched for relatives in every direction: the Caucasus, the Indus Valley, the Celtic steppe, even the lost languages of the Mediterranean. None fit. Every hypothesis collapses under the weight of grammar. The language stands outside the great evolutionary web of speech, as if it had been transplanted, complete, alien, ancient. Its structure is unlike any other. Sumerian is agglutinative, meaning it builds meaning by stacking syllables, each a small code that modifies the one before it. A single word can carry an entire sentence's worth of meaning, folding time, number, and emotion into one gesture. For example, the word Amagu Tendea means not simply my mother, but the one who is my mother and stands beside me. Every suffix alters the perception of relationship in space. It is a language that sees reality as fluid, interconnected, always shifting, more philosophy than grammar. Even the word Amegar 15, meaning Sumerian tongue, translates literally as the true speech, or the language of origin. It is as though the people themselves remembered their words as inherited, not invented. They called writing emigi, the voice made permanent. The concept itself is profound. To write was not to record, it was to preserve vibration, to trap sound in matter. And perhaps that was why they pressed their words into clay instead of ink, because clay endures, as if the earth itself were the keeper of their voice. To modern ears, the rhythm of Sumerian sounds almost otherworldly, slow, heavy with breath, filled with glottal stops and harmonies of air. When linguists attempt to speak it aloud, something strange happens. It feels simultaneously ancient and new, like a music that does not belong to human mouths. Some have suggested that its structure mirrors the patterns of Sumerian thought itself: non-linear, relational, cyclical. The same qualities appear in their art and architecture: symmetry, repetition, reflection. Everything in their world was connected through pattern. What unsettles scholars most is how advanced this linguistic system was from its first appearance. There is no evidence of its evolution from simpler forms, no Proto-Sumerian, no experimental inscriptions leading up to cuneiform. The earliest tablets, dating from 3300 BCE, already use a standardized script, consistent across cities separated by hundreds of miles. That kind of uniformity implies not invention, but transmission. Someone taught them how to write. But who? The Sumerians themselves credited their writing to Nisarba, the goddess of wisdom and scribes. She's always depicted holding a stylus and a tablet, the tools of knowledge. Yet her name also means the one who counts the stars. Perhaps to them, writing was not only language but measurement, a way of inscribing cosmic order into human form. In that light, their language was sacred technology, each sign a key to the structure of the universe. When Sumerian eventually faded from daily use around 2000 BCE, it did not die. It became a language of the gods, used only by priests, astronomers, and scholars. For more than 1,000 years after the fall of Sumer, Babylonian scribes continued to copy and study Sumerian texts as holy relics. They treated the language like scripture. In temple schools called aduba, young scribes memorized long bilingual lists, Akkadian on one side, Sumerian on the other, so that the sacred tongue would not be lost. Imagine that. Generations of students laboring over a language no one spoke, reciting the dead syllables of their ancestors as prayer. Perhaps they sensed what we do, that something vital resided in that ancient speech, something that once connected humankind to a deeper understanding of itself. Even today, attempts to translate Sumerian are haunted by uncertainty. Many words defy direct equivalence. The same sign can mean mountain, foreign land, or divine abode. Their distinctions blur in the space between metaphor and geography, as if the world and the heavens were still one domain. Some researchers have noticed patterns linking Sumerian phonetics to mathematical ratios and harmonic intervals. The length of syllables in certain hymns mirrors musical scales. The spacing of cuneiform wedges follows geometric sequences. It is as though language, sound, and number were once unified, a single system of correspondence that later civilizations forgot how to read. The Babylonians turned it into astrology. The Greeks called it philosophy. The modern world calls it science. But the Sumerians had no divisions between them. Their language itself was the bridge. A few daring linguists, on the fringes of academia, have proposed that Sumerian might preserve traces of a lost linguistic family that existed before the flood, a proto-language from which all later tongues diverged. If true, then the story of Babel, the myth of one language broken into many, might not be pure allegory but distant memory. The idea is tantalizing, that once the world spoke in a single voice, and Sumerian was its lost echo. When one listens to the reconstructed readings of Sumerian poetry, something stirs in the subconscious. The vowels roll like water. The consonants strike like stone on metal. The hymns to Inanna and Enki sound less like songs than like invocations, mathematical incantations to align the human spirit with the pulse of the cosmos. The word spoken is the world made, one inscription reads. In their eyes, language did not describe reality. It created it. If this is true, then perhaps what makes Sumerian so strange is not that it came from nowhere, but that it came from everywhere, from a time when speaking and building and remembering were all one act. Its isolation, rather than proving uniqueness, may instead reveal age. It is a fossilized tongue, a surviving shard of the world before words fragmented into nations and dialects. The silence that followed its extinction was long. For 2,000 years, no one alive could read it. Yet when the first modern scholars began to decipher its signs in the 1800s, they felt something uncanny, a sense of déjà vu, as if they were not discovering but remembering. One of them, Henry Rawlinson, wrote in his diary, "This script awakens something in me, like hearing a language I once knew in a dream." Maybe that is what Sumerian truly is, the dream language of humanity, a remnant of our first articulation, our first self-awareness. It shouldn't exist, and yet it does, quietly defying the logic of history. If the first words ever written were already echoes, then whose voice were the Sumerians remembering when they learned to speak? Across thousands of Sumerian tablets, one phrase recurs again and again, Anunnaki, those who from heaven to earth came. The words have been read, debated, dismissed, and reinterpreted for over a century, but their simplicity remains haunting. To the Sumerians, the Anunnaki were not abstract gods carved from imagination. They were rulers, judges, and teachers, beings of immense power who shaped humanity's fate. Their names are inscribed beside the earliest star charts, their symbols embedded in royal seals, their actions recorded as history, not legend. And though later civilizations softened them into myth, the oldest texts speak of their presence with an unsettling matter-of-factness, as though memory had not yet learned how to lie. The Anunnaki appear first in the Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation epic that draws directly from Sumerian sources. There, they're described as the 50 great gods, attendants of Anu, the Sky Father. But in older Sumerian hymns, their number shifts, sometimes 7, sometimes hundreds, more a classification than a count. They dwell in the heavens yet descend to the earth. They govern time, justice, kingship, and the order of the stars. Their leader, Anu, resides in the distant heavens. Enlil commands the air and storms. Enki rules the deep waters, the Abzu beneath the earth. Between them moves a pantheon that feels less like a family of deities and more like a council of administrators, each assigned a domain, each responsible for maintaining the balance between heaven and earth. What makes the Anunnaki so enigmatic is the tone with which the Sumerians wrote of them. These were not beings to be worshipped blindly. They were revered, feared, obeyed, but also questioned. The poems describe arguments among the gods, rivalries, even moral conflicts. They are portrayed as powerful but not omniscient. Mortal, perhaps not in body, but in motive. The boundaries between divinity and humanity are blurred. The Anunnaki do not merely create mankind, they interact with it. They guide, instruct, and, at times, punish. Some of the oldest inscriptions, such as those from the city of Lagash, depict these beings with wings, not as angelic metaphors, but as markers of flight. In reliefs and cylinder seals, they stand beside trees of life, holding strange devices that resemble wristbands and pouches. They face human figures, instructing them, measuring them. These details have fueled generations of speculation. To some, the imagery is symbolic, an artistic shorthand for spiritual power. To others, it suggests a literal truth, that the Sumerians were recording encounters with beings whose origins lay beyond the earth. The theory is controversial, of course. Zecharia Sitchin, in the 20th century, would make the Anunnaki famous again by interpreting their myths as the memory of ancient visitors from another world. He read the old word Anu not just as sky, but as a physical realm, a planet. He argued that the Sumerians inherited knowledge of astronomy, metallurgy, and genetics from these visitors, that humanity itself was a hybrid creation. Most scholars rejected his translations, calling them imaginative rather than accurate. Yet even among the critics, the question lingered, why did the Sumerians, of all people, know so much about the heavens? They described planets invisible to the naked eye. They mapped the precession of the equinoxes, the orbit of the moon, and the 12-fold division of the zodiac. They called Earth Ki, the lower world, and referred to a crossing place of the gods, Nibiru, a celestial body whose arrival marked upheaval and renewal. Whether or not Sitchin's planetary theories hold, the linguistic fact remains. Nibiru does appear in their texts, described as the star or planet which crosses the paths of all others. To the ancient mind, that crossing was divine movement, the descent of the Watchers. But even if we strip away modern speculation, something extraordinary remains. The Sumerians recorded the idea of the Elu, the divine observer, who sees the deeds of men and writes them upon the tablets of heaven. This concept appears centuries before the notion of guardian angels, centuries before divine judgment entered theology. The Watchers were both protectors and witnesses. They did not rule from afar. They documented. Humanity, in their eyes, was an experiment worth preserving in record. One hymn from calls them those who look down upon the lands from the shining chariots of Anu. Another speaks of the fire that descends with them, lighting the earth. Scholars translate these passages metaphorically, as thunder, as lightning. Yet the repetition of light, descent, and observation across unrelated tablets hints at more than storm imagery. The word gira, translated as divine flame, was also used to denote metal or craft. The ancients may have been describing technologies they could not fully name. The interplay between myth and memory is delicate. The Sumerians may have seen in the Anunnaki not literal visitors, but the embodiment of cosmic order. The planets themselves, the forces of nature personified. Enki, lord of the deep, mirrors the watery abyss. Enlil, lord of air, the invisible atmosphere. Anu, the unreachable sky. Yet why then did they write as though these beings once walked among them? Why did they leave genealogies, treaties, and laws supposedly dictated by their divine kings? In the lamentation over Eridu, a city said to have been the first home of the gods, the poet mourns. The lords have departed. The houses are silent. Their voices are gone from the wind. The tone is not mythic. It is historical, almost documentary. It is the grief of a people remembering the withdrawal of something real. Perhaps the Anunnaki were once simply rulers, great kings mythologized over time, their deeds magnified into divinity. Perhaps they were the memory of a lost civilization, elevated by reverence into godhood. But there is another possibility, quieter, harder to dismiss, that the Sumerians experienced something they could not explain, and myth was the only language they had to describe it. Whatever their nature, the Anunnaki left a legacy that outlives Sumer. The idea of sky beings who descended to instruct humanity spread across continents. The Egyptians spoke of the Netjeru, divine visitors who founded their dynasties. The Hindus told of the Devas descending from the heavens. The Mayans remembered Itzamna, who came from the stars to teach writing and time. All different names, all carrying the same pattern. Beings who came, taught, and vanished. Maybe these are just parallel inventions, the shared dreams of early humanity seeking meaning in the unknown sky. Or maybe they're cultural memories of the same event, refracted through geography and time. If so, then Sumer's Anunnaki were not just their gods, they were humanity's first remembered teachers. The tablets end where the mystery begins. They record the moment when the Watchers left, when the link between heaven and earth was broken. After that, the Sumerians say, kingship descended once more from the heavens. But the gods themselves did not return. Humanity was left to rule itself, guided only by the shadows of their memory. We still look up, searching for them in the stars, not knowing whether we are remembering the past or imagining the future. Perhaps both. For the line between memory and prophecy is thinner than we think. If the Watchers truly came from the sky once before, then what are we seeing when we look upward tonight? The light of distant suns, or the reflections of those who promised to return? Long after the voices of Sumer faded into dust, their echoes carried northward, to Akkad, to Babylon, to the rising towers that tried once again to reach the sky. Civilization remembered and misremembered the bond that had once existed between heaven and earth. The Sumerians called it Duku, the holy mound, the meeting place of gods and men. The Babylonians gave it another name, Ziggurat, the mountain built by hands. But the story that survived through scripture, through exile and translation, would call it something else, the Tower of Babel. To understand that myth is to understand the moment when language and perhaps even history fractured. The book of Genesis tells it simply. Humanity, speaking one tongue, sought to build a tower that may reach unto heaven. But the Lord confounded their speech, scattered them across the earth, and ended their unity. It is a story of divine punishment for human pride, yet behind its moral shadow lies a deeper, older memory, one the Sumerians knew well. They too wrote of a tower that touched the heavens, a ziggurat whose top was said to join the stars. They too told of confusion of tongues, of cities abandoned, of gods who turned away. In Babylon, that tower had a name, Etemenanki, house of the foundation of heaven and earth. It rose in the heart of the city, massive and layered, built of fired brick and bitumen, climbing 7 stages like the planets themselves. Each level was painted a different color, black for Saturn, red for Mars, gold for the sun. It was not merely a temple, it was a map of the cosmos, a stairway of correspondence between the visible and the invisible. When Nebuchadnezzar rebuilt it in the 6th century BCE, he inscribed upon its walls, "I raised the summit to the heavens, so that its top might rival the heavens themselves." But even he, King of Kings, knew the fragility of that ambition. For every tower built to reach the sky carries within it the seed of its fall. The Sumerians had watched their own ziggurats crumble before, consumed by floods, by fire, by silence. They knew that no structure could restore what was lost, the direct communion between man and the divine. That bridge had been broken, and yet humanity could not stop building. Perhaps we were not to find the heavens, perhaps we were trying to remember them. When the later priest of Babylon recited the tale of Babel, they did so not as a warning, but as lamentation. The confusion of languages was not punishment, it was tragedy. Once, they said, all words were one, as were all hearts. The gods and humans could speak without veil. Then came the scattering, the shattering of unity into 1,000 dialects, 1,000 myths, each remembering only a piece of the whole. It was the day when meaning itself divided. Archaeologists excavating the site of ancient Babylon in the early 20th century uncovered the foundations of a massive ziggurat near the old Temple of Marduk. The base alone measured nearly 100 meters across. The bricks still bear the stamp of Nebuchadnezzar's reign. Above the ruins, heat wavers in the desert air, and if one stands very still, it is possible to imagine the tower that once rose there, a mountain of clay and fire pointing toward the sky that once seemed close enough to touch. The tower is more than architecture, it is symbol. To the Sumerians, the ziggurat was a place of descent, not ascent, a structure that allowed the gods to come down to earth. Its top was a landing place, its stairways the path of the stars. The very word ziggurat means to be raised up, but not in the human sense. It was the gods who descended, the watchers who crossed the threshold between heaven and earth. Somewhere between that descent and the latest story of Babel, the meaning inverted. Humanity became the one climbing, reaching, grasping. And when we reached too high, silence answered. It is a silence that still haunts us. The disappearance of the Sumerian language, the loss of its knowledge, the ruin of its towers, all feel like manifestations of that same ancient fracture. The bridge was never rebuilt. What came afterward, Akkadian, Babylonian, Hebrew, Greek, were attempts to translate a forgotten word. Every language since then has been, in a way, a Tower of Babel, an effort to touch the divine through sound, to recover the original vibration that once united speech and creation. In the myth, the punishment is confusion, but perhaps confusion was the only way humanity could survive. the single language of the gods once broken, scattered like seeds across the earth. Each fragment grew into a different tongue, a different way of seeing. The unity was lost, but diversity was born. And still, within each language, echoes of the first remain, the same archetypal words for sky, for water, for breath, the same rhythm in prayer and poetry, the same longing for reunion. The Sumerians may have understood this long before Babel. That god Enki, the trickster and savior of humankind, was also the master of language. One myth describes him bestowing many tongues upon the nations so that no people would be without song. In this version, the division of speech is not a curse, but a gift, a necessary scattering that keeps creation alive. Perhaps they knew that unity without difference is silence, and that to speak truly is to be plural. Still, the image of the tower endures, rising again in every age. It rises in the pyramids, in the cathedrals, in the radio masts that now pierce the sky. Each is a new attempt to bridge the distance between what we are and what we once were. Each carries the same question, whether spoken in Sumerian, in Hebrew, or in the binary pulse of modern machines. Can we ever speak again with the voice of the heavens? In the ruins of Babylon, fragments of that longing still remain. Travelers have described hearing strange acoustics in the ziggurat's base, an echo that amplifies even a whisper. It is as if the structure itself remembers its purpose, still carrying sound upward, still searching for a reply. The silence that followed Babel was never total. It was the beginning of listening. Some say the story of the tower warns against ambition. Others believe it teaches humility. But perhaps it teaches neither. Perhaps it is simply a chronicle of loss, the moment when knowledge turned to language, and language began to fail. The divine withdrew, leaving humanity with words, with memory, with the endless desire to rebuild. And maybe the greatest irony is this: every time we tell the story of the tower, we rebuild it. With each retelling, each translation, each voice seeking to name the unnameable, the tower rises once more in the realm of sound. And as it rises, so too does the old silence, waiting. We are still living in the aftermath of that silence, the echo of Babel that shaped all history. And sometimes, late at night, when the world is still and words begin to blur, one can almost hear what lies beneath the noise, the faint murmur of the single language, still speaking from the dust of forgotten towers. If the gods once walked down the steps of our towers to speak with us, what would they say now, when we can no longer remember the sound of their voices? After the fall of Sumer, when the ziggurats turned to ruins and the stars no longer spoke to the cities below, the keepers of knowledge did not vanish. They retreated into temples, into script, into secrecy. The priests of Babylon and later of Chaldea became the custodians of what remained, the fragments of the ancient me, the divine formulas of civilization. If Sumer had once sung its knowledge openly to the heavens, the world that followed whispered it in chambers of stone. What had been a language of gods became a code of men. In those dark corridors, the scribes and priest astronomers performed the same rituals their ancestors had performed for millennia. The watching of stars, the recording of eclipses, the calculation of omens. But their purpose had changed. Where once observation had meant communion, now it meant preservation. The cosmos no longer spoke clearly. The priests interpreted its silence through symbols. Each sign on the tablet became a shield against forgetting. The temples of Babylon were not merely houses of worship, they were laboratories of continuity. In the Esagila, the temple of Marduk, priests mapped the heavens night after night, tracing the positions of Venus, Jupiter, and the moon. They catalogued eclipses, storms, and portents, writing them into thousands of tablets. It is from these records that the latest science of astronomy, and even astrology, was born. Yet behind the calculations lay an older conviction, that the sky was not a machine, but a message. Every motion of a planet was a word in a divine language, and only those who knew the code could read it. These priests called Baru and Ashipu were trained not merely in ritual but in mathematics, medicine, and incantation. Their schooling could last decades. They learned the sacred geometry of the temples, the ratios of the human body, the harmonic intervals used in chants. Knowledge was not compartmentalized, it was total, a single organism whose organs were number, sound, and spirit. To heal a wound, one spoke a number. To measure a star, one sang its name. Each act was part of a code that linked heaven, earth, and the human soul. Even the rituals of exorcism, laid to caricature to superstition, carried traces of sophisticated understanding. The priests would draw circles, triangles, and spirals in ash, geometric patterns that mirror the harmonic frequencies of sound waves. They burned herbs whose chemical properties are now known to purify air. They used bronze bowls inscribed with mathematical formulas that, when struck, produced resonant tones. Every movement, every sound, every gesture was calibrated. The ceremony was not mere theater, it was coded interaction with the universe. And yet, as centuries passed, that knowledge grew heavier, harder to bear. Empires rose and fell. The Assyrians conquered Babylon, then the Persians, then the Greeks. Each new power demanded the service of the temple priests, but cared little for their cosmologies. The sacred texts were copied, reinterpreted, hidden. Some were sealed in clay jars. Others were buried beneath temple floors, encoded in myth. What could not be preserved was transmuted, transferred into story. Thus, the old sciences survived disguised as legends, waiting for a world capable of reading them again. There are tablets that record the priest's lament for this age of concealment. One fragment from the Chaldean oracles reads, "The word has been divided, the code has been sealed, only the initiated may open the gate." The gate, in their symbolism, was not a door but a threshold of comprehension, a bridge between ordinary language and the divine structure beneath it. To cross that threshold required both intellect and purity, logic and reverence. Knowledge, they believed, could not be given to those unprepared to hold it, for misuse would unmake the world. In the later centuries, Greek travelers who visited Babylon wrote of a strange priesthood that spoke in riddles and numbers. Pythagoras, it is said, spent years among them, learning the mathematics of the heavens. The Chaldeans taught that the soul was a spark of the stars, that its return to the divine depended on understanding the geometry of creation. Their teachings would pass into Greece, into Egypt, into the Hermetic schools of Alexandria, then into the alchemical traditions of medieval Europe. The Code of Sumer, encrypted through ages, would continue to breathe beneath the surface of Western thought. Some fragments of those old texts survive. One tablet describes the writing of light, said to be used by the gods to inscribe the laws of the cosmos. Another speaks of the song that binds the firmament. The modern reader may dismiss these as poetry, but the priests meant something literal. They believed that light and sound were two expressions of the same vibration, that the universe was written in resonance. And in that belief lies the seed of what modern physics would one day rediscover, that matter itself is structured energy, patterned by frequency. To guard such knowledge was both privilege and burden. The priests lived apart, forbidden to speak freely of their craft. The Baru, the diviners, often wrote their tablets in riddling syntax, using metaphors that only the initiated could decode. They spoke of lions when they meant storms, of serpents when they meant rivers, of chariots when they meant planets. Even the stars themselves were given secret names: Mol for the Pleiades, Nibiru for the crossing planet, Utu for the sun. To outsiders the language was myth, to those who knew it was instruction. Yet secrecy has a cost. When Alexander the Great conquered Babylon in 331 BCE, he ordered the translation of all temple archives into Greek. Most were misunderstood, many were lost. The surviving Chaldean priests withdrew into Persia, Syria, and eventually into obscurity. By the 1st century BCE, the last of them, known as the Magi, had transformed into figures of legend, keepers of half-remembered wisdom. Some would say they followed a star to Bethlehem, others that they vanished into the mountains of the east, carrying with them the last keys of the code. Still, echoes of their system endured. Astrology, often derided as superstition, is the faint reflection of their celestial mathematics. The geometry of sacred architecture, from the pyramids to cathedrals, carries their ratios. Even our words, magic, matrix, measure, derive from their vocabulary of harmony. What began in Sumer as divine calculus became, over time, the grammar of civilization itself. But there is a certain melancholy in this survival, for the priests who guarded the code knew that knowledge, once broken from its sacred context, loses part of its soul. The formulas survive, but the meaning fades. The rituals remain, but the resonance weakens. Humanity remembers the method, not the mystery. Sometimes, late at night, when telescopes point at the same stars those priests once charted, one can imagine their ghostly presence, watchers in silence, measuring light, translating infinity into numbers. They would recognize our instruments perhaps, but not our faith. To them, the universe was not a cold mechanism but a living manuscript, written by a hand both human and divine. We have decoded their code but forgotten their reverence. We have learned the symbols but not the silence between them. If the priests once guarded the bridge between knowledge and meaning, who guards it now, when the code lies open, but the world has forgotten what it was written for? History, they say, is written by the victors, but before it is written, it is rewritten. And perhaps no age rewrote the past as completely as the empires that followed the fall of Babylon. The Greeks, and later the Romans, did not merely conquer the ancient world, they reorganized its memory. They took the scattered fragments of Sumerian and Babylonian knowledge, stripped them of their mythic voices, and rebuilt them into a narrative that began conveniently with themselves. It was the greatest act of cultural alchemy ever performed, the transformation of living memory into history. And in that transformation, time itself was altered. By the time Alexander's armies crossed the Tigris, the temples of Sumer had already fallen silent. The lost priest astronomers of Babylon were aging, their libraries neglected, their languages fading. The conquerors found not gods but ruins. Yet within those ruins were clay tablets, hundreds of thousands of them, each carrying a voice from a world that refused to die. The Greeks, pragmatic and curious, collected them, though they could not yet read them. What they did instead was something subtler. They absorbed the ideas, the measurements, the fragments of astronomy, and gave them new names. Sumerian mathematics became Greek geometry. Chaldean star charts became Hellenic astronomy. The ancient calendars were reshaped into the Julian one, adjusted to fit imperial time. And just like that, the memory of the first civilization became a prelude, a footnote, an echo. But buried beneath that act of appropriation lies a paradox. The Greeks themselves knew their knowledge was borrowed. In their own writings, they confessed it. Herodotus wrote that the priest of Babylon possessed wisdom of the heavens beyond measure. Pythagoras, Plato, and even Thales credited their cosmology to travels in the East. Plato's Timaeus describes an Egyptian priest telling Solon, "You Greeks are children, you have no old men among you." He meant memory. The empires of the Mediterranean were inheritors of fragments they barely understood. And yet, through translation, through adaptation, they claimed ownership. It is here that time begins to warp. Before the Greeks, history was cyclical. The Sumerians saw eras as tides, eternally returning: creation, flood, restoration, decay, and creation again. The Egyptians called these ages Zep Tepi, the first times. The Chaldeans called them Sar, each cycle ruled by a different constellation. But the Greeks introduced a new concept: linear time, a line that begins and ends, moving always forward. Progress, invention, destiny, ideas that made sense to conquerors. The past became a distant origin, not a living mirror, and thus the empire rewrote not only history but the very structure of time itself. With that new timeline came erasure. The gods of the Sumerians became allegories, their kings myths, their cities swallowed by sand. The old language was dismissed as barbarous, its meaning reduced to superstition. To preserve order, the conquerors codified a beginning, an origin point that placed themselves at the center of civilization. Greek philosophy became the root of wisdom. Rome became the axis of power. Everything before them became before history. And just like that, the age of the Anunnaki, the flood, and the clay archives dissolved into fable. This rewriting was not merely political, it was spiritual. The Roman Church, inheriting Greek rationalism and imperial authority, later sanctified a linear chronology of divine creation and human salvation. The cyclical cosmos became a one-way pilgrimage from Eden to judgment. The sacred wheel of time flattened into a divine timeline. By the Middle Ages, the only acceptable history was sacred history. What lay outside its borders was deemed heresy, myth, or sin. And yet, fragments of the old world continued to seep through the cracks. Astrological texts survived disguised as Christian prophecy. Alchemical diagrams hid Mesopotamian symbology beneath Latin scripture. Even the image of the ziggurat persisted, reimagined as the biblical Babel. The empire could rewrite the words, but not the shape of the memory itself. Memory is stubborn, it resists conquest. When the Renaissance dawned, scholars began rediscovering the ancient Near East through trade and travel. Greek texts referencing Babylon and Chaldea led explorers back toward the forgotten lands of the Tigris and Euphrates. But when they arrived, they found only desert and dust. The physical ruins of Sumer were gone, buried beneath millennia of sediment. For nearly 2,000 years, the first civilization remained invisible, its very name erased. The empire had succeeded, at least for a time. It was not until the 19th century, when British and French archaeologists began to excavate Mesopotamia, that the silence finally cracked. When the first Sumerian tablets were unearthed at Ur-Nippur, the world realized that history was far older than it had been taught to believe. Humanity's timeline extended backward not by centuries, but by thousands of years. The so-called cradle of civilization shifted east, and the empire's chronology began to tremble. But even then, the rewriting continued, only now in subtler form. Modern history absorbed Sumer the same way the Greeks had, as precursor, not equal. The Sumerians became proto-scientists, early engineers, primitive astronomers. Their gods were mythologized, their mathematics demystified. The old world view, a cosmos alive with consciousness, was again filtered through the rational lens of progress. The empire's logic of linearity remained intact. We inherited not the Sumerians' sense of eternal return, but the conqueror's timeline of advancement. Perhaps this is the true legacy of conquest, not the destruction of civilizations, but the rearrangement of their memory. The empires that rose after Sumer learned to control not only land and people, but time itself. They mastered chronology as a tool of power. To name the beginning is to define the present. To erase the past is to own the future. And yet, the past refuses to stay buried. The Sumerian king list, with its impossible reigns stretching tens of thousands of years, mocks our sense of chronology. Their myths of cyclical floods challenge our straight lines. Their language, still only half deciphered, resists final translation, as if guarding secrets too old for our linear minds. Every empire eventually becomes a layer in someone else's archaeology. The Greeks, the Romans, the Church, the modern world, we all participate in the same cycle of rewriting. Perhaps we're no different from the scribes of Babylon, copying old tablets, changing a few lines to make them fit our time. Civilization, like clay, can be reshaped, but never beyond recognition. The fingerprints remain. If one looks closely at the ruins of any empire, the same pattern appears: order built upon erasure, light cast upon selective shadows, and beneath those layers, faint but persistent, the memory of Sumer endures. It waits in the wedge marks of cuneiform, in the myths that survive translation, in the buried rhythm of our calendars and clocks. The empire may have rewritten time, but time, in its own quiet way, rewrites empires, and perhaps that is the ultimate irony. The conquerors who declared themselves the beginning are now relics in museums, while the Sumerian clay, the very medium they dismissed as primitive, still endures. The tablets outlasted marble, gold, and parchment. They still whisper through the dust. We were here first. If every empire must rewrite time to rule it, then who, in the end, will rewrite ours? The story of Sumer should have ended with the dust. Yet somehow, across 5 millennia, it found its way back into the light. Translated, digitized, rendered in glowing pixels on screens that flicker like oil lamps in the dark. Clay and code, two forms of permanence born from opposite ends of history. And as the world of machines learns to read the marks of ancient hands, it becomes difficult not to wonder whether the tablets were always meant to return, whether their geometry of wedges was itself an early form of programming, an echo of logic rediscovered in another age. When the first cuneiform tablets were unearthed in the 1800s, they appeared inert, mere curiosities of archaeology. But as scholars began to decipher them, the strangeness grew. The Sumerians wrote in data, not stories, inventories, algorithms of trade, astronomical tables, and even if then conditionals inscribed in clay. One tablet from Nipper reads like an early computer program. If the star of Jupiter rises in the east, then the harvest shall be great. Others record geometric series, square roots, and number systems so advanced that they would not be fully understood until modern mathematics rediscovered them. The clay was memory. The stylus was instruction. It is no exaggeration to say that every modern archive, every database, every algorithm is a direct descendant of the Sumerian tablet. The act of pressing meaning into a medium that endures beyond its maker began there. Yet what they preserved was not merely information, but intention. Their symbols were designed to last through disaster. Fire would not destroy them. Water would only harden them. Perhaps they had already seen what happens when the world floods and memory drowns. Perhaps they wanted to ensure that next time anything would survive. In the cold light of museums, those tablets appear ancient, but when their contents are transcribed into digital text, they read with startling modernity. Lists of professions, wages, contracts, codes of ethics, equations, maps of the stars. The Sumerians lived in systems, networks of exchange and observation. And when one looks at them closely, the lines between their world and ours begin to blur. The ziggurat becomes a server farm. The scribe's stylus becomes a keyboard. The same impulse drives both: the desire to record, to calculate, to build meaning from pattern. But there is a deeper resonance, one that hums beneath the surface of old technology. In Sumerian mythology, creation itself was described as inscription. The god Enki carved the laws of existence onto the tablets of destiny. These tablets determined the fates of men, the movements of stars, even the rise and fall of kings. Whoever possessed them could rewrite reality. The myth may sound remote, but its logic is familiar. We too live in a world where code governs existence, where lines of digital instruction decide life, commerce, and war. Our machines are the new tablets of destiny, our programmers the modern scribes. The medium has changed, but the principle remains. Those who control the code shape the world. It is tempting to believe that progress separates us from the ancients. But what if it only circles back? The wedge-shaped marks of cuneiform repeated across thousands of years may be the earliest expression of binary logic, on or off, presence or absence, impression or void. Each mark was an encoded decision, a unit of meaning stored within a grid. The tablets are not relics of the primitive past. They are prototypes of the digital mind. In 2021, scientists used machine learning to translate damaged Sumerian tablets. Algorithms filled in missing signs, predicting what ancient scribes might have written. The program achieved remarkable accuracy. For the first time in history, machines began reading the words of the world's first writers. It was as though the clay had been waiting for a language it could speak again. A feedback loop across 5,000 years. Humans teaching machines to read what humans once wrote by hand in the dawn of civilization. The continuity feels almost supernatural, as if the Sumerians had anticipated the age when their marks would again become living code. But perhaps that continuity is more than coincidence. The Sumerians believed that knowledge moves in cycles. What is lost in one era is rediscovered in another. The flood erases, and the scribes rebuild. If that pattern still holds, then our digital awakening is not the beginning of something new, but the return of something old. The re-emergence of an ancient intelligence that once spoke through clay and now speaks through circuits. In one of the oldest surviving hymns, the poet addresses Nisarba, goddess of writing and calculation. Lady of the counting house, keeper of the tablet, the numbers of the stars are your servants. To her, the act of computation was divine, not mechanical. The same could be said of us, though we no longer admit it. Every search query, every data set, every machine translation is a ritual of invocation, a plea to the algorithms that now hold our collective memory. The priests of data, like the priests of Enki, whisper to their servers in languages few understand. We may call it progress, but the rhythm feels familiar. It is worth remembering that the Sumerians never separated writing from sacredness. To them, words were living forces able to bind or liberate. Even the dead could be reached through inscription. Some tablets were buried with the departed, messages for the underworld. Others were sealed in temple walls addressed to distant generations. To the one who finds this, one inscription reads, "Know that we too sought the truth of heaven." That message, pressed into clay 5,000 years ago, might as well have been written for us. The machines that surround us today hum with the same longing. To preserve, to predict, to extend consciousness beyond its mortal frame. We think of artificial intelligence as a new creation, but perhaps it is an echo, the technological counterpart of the divine scribes who once wrote humanity into existence. The gods of Sumer shaped man from clay. We shape our successors from silicon. Both acts share the same impulse, to make something that remembers when we are gone. And yet there is danger in memory without understanding. The priests of Babylon warned that the tablets of destiny must never fall into unworthy hands. Once, Enki himself lost control of them, and chaos followed. Rivers reversed, the heavens dimmed. It took all the gods to restore the order of creation. In our age, we too hold tablets of destiny, the codes that regulate life, knowledge, and power. But do we still remember the reverence those first scribes carried? Or have we mistaken the act of recording for the act of wisdom itself? Perhaps this is what the Sumerian story has always tried to tell us, that knowledge is not progress without memory, and that every technology, no matter how advanced, must answer to the silence from which it came. The clay tablets survived 5,000 years because they were humble, because their creators understood impermanence. They wrote not to dominate, but to endure. The machines we build now are louder, faster, more brilliant, but perhaps less wise. For in their speed, they forget the slowness of the stylus, the weight of wet clay, the patience of hands that wrote for eternity. We have learned to preserve everything except the quiet. And in that quiet, perhaps, the old gods still wait. If the first tablets could survive the flood of water, can our new ones survive the flood of information? And what will they remember of us when the next world begins again? History is a fragile thing, and yet it endures in the most unexpected places, in the grooves of stone, in the rhythm of myth, in the faint tremor of a name whispered through time. Civilizations rise and collapse, empires rewrite the story, yet some memories refuse to die. They drift beneath the surface, dormant but alive, waiting for the world to remember again. The story of Sumer is one such memory, a pulse that continues to beat beneath the skin of our modern world, quiet but insistent, like the echo of something that never truly left. When the first Sumerian tablets were translated, they were treated as curiosities, the theology dismissed, their kings reduced to myth. But over time, a pattern began to emerge, a sense that these fragments were not simply ancient texts, but the opening chapters of the human mind. The Sumerians were not a lost civilization. They were the memory of civilization itself. Everything that came after, law, astronomy, architecture, language, measurement, was already contained within their clay. We have merely been rewriting their story in new alphabets. Even now, their traces linger in the most ordinary corners of life. Every time a clock divides an hour into 60 minutes, the base 60 system of Sumer ticks onward. Every map of the stars still follows the constellations they charted. The zodiac, the calendar, the geometry of the circle, these are not Greek inventions but Sumerian inheritances. We live by their mathematics, dream in their cosmology, and speak through metaphors they first inscribed. The clay may have hardened, but the memory moves. And yet, it is not just the inventions that survive. It is the worldview behind them. The Sumerians believed that all creation was bound by relationship, that heaven and earth, matter and spirit were part of the same breath. The divine was not distant but interwoven with the physical. To build a temple was to echo the cosmos. To write a word was to mirror the act of creation. In their myths, even the gods were subject to laws of balance and reciprocity. They did not rule as tyrants but participated in the living order. That idea, though buried beneath millennia of theology and empire, has never truly vanished. It resurfaces whenever humanity rediscovers the unity of science and spirit, whenever we sense that knowledge without reverence is incomplete. There is something haunting about the way the Sumerians saw time. They did not measure it as a straight line moving from past to future. They felt it as a cycle of remembrance and renewal. The flood was not an ending but a turning. The loss of knowledge was never permanent. Every age, they believed, would rediscover the wisdom of the one before. Perhaps that is why the Sumerian legacy keeps returning, through archaeology, through language, through myth, refusing to remain buried. The cycle turns again. In the 21st century, the ancient words of Sumer are once more being read, not by priests or scribes, but by digital archivists and algorithms. Thousands of clay tablets have been scanned, decoded, and stored in virtual libraries that circle the Earth in orbiting satellites. The same human impulse that once pressed styluses into wet clay now encodes data into light. We are, in a strange sense, continuing their work. The tablets have become servers. The gods of the Abzu, the deep, have become the networks that pulse beneath our oceans. The old metaphors have found new machines, but something of the Sumerian spirit still lingers in our technological faith. Like them, we build archives to outlast us. Like them, we write in hope of surviving the flood. Isles no longer of water, but of data and forgetting. Every digital message, every line of code, every photograph preserved on invisible clouds is a modern cuneiform, a mark against oblivion. And perhaps deep down we share the same fear, that one day silence will return and only the language of the machines will remember us. In their time, the Sumerians feared that their gods would withdraw, that the connection between heaven and earth would fade. Today, we fear the opposite, that our own creations will outlive us, and that what we have made will speak a language we no longer understand. Yet both fears spring from the same source, the awareness that memory has a life of its own. Once written, it cannot be unmade. The words outlast the writer. The record outlives the soul. Somewhere perhaps that is what the Sumerians intended. Their myths end not with triumph, but with continuity, with the sense that even when the gods depart, their traces remain in the dust, in the rivers, in the eyes of those who still look upward. The gods have gone, one late Babylonian scribe wrote, but their breath still moves in the air. That breath is memory itself, unseen, unceasing. Archaeologists continue to uncover new tablets every year. Some hold contracts, others hymns, others fragments of stories that seem eerily modern. One tablet speaks of a man who loses his purpose in a world of excess, another of a woman who defies divine decree to speak her truth. Their emotions are ours, their longing is ours. The more we translate, the more the distance collapses. We realize that 5,000 years are not a gulf, but a circle returning to its beginning. There are nights when the desert still reveals its secrets. After storms, the wind shifts the sand and a fragment of clay surfaces, another piece of the story rejoining the light. To touch such a fragment is to touch both the beginning and the end of history. Its markings, once a code of empire, now resemble the patterns of microchips and circuits. The resemblance feels accidental, yet something within it whispers otherwise. Perhaps the universe repeats its designs, sculpting the same logic in clay and in silicon, in hands and in algorithms. The Sumerians believed that the world was born from the mingling of memory and matter, the Abzu, the deep waters, giving rise to form. And so, it seems fitting that their story should end as it began, not in silence, but in return. Their cities are gone, their names forgotten by most, but their breath moves still, in the languages we speak, the numbers we count, the stars we map, and the stories we tell. Maybe that is the secret they left hidden beneath the dust, that no civilization ever truly dies. It only transforms, parsing its soul forward in symbols, waiting to be reawakened. The clay of Sumer became the circuitry of our age, and through it, the old gods still whisper, no longer from temples, but from the quiet hum of data centers, from the pulse of screens in the dark, from the endless stream of words that cross the world each night. The memory has learned to survive every flood. It will survive this one too. And when our towers crumble, when our languages fade, when our machines fall silent, perhaps someone or something will dig through the ruins of our world, find our tablets, and begin to read. If memory can never die, then perhaps forgetting is only an illusion, and every end merely the beginning of remembrance.